14 billion years ago, the Big Bang gave birth to our universe. Over 3.5 billion years ago, life began on Earth. Today, human beings rule the planet. At the center of their obvious success, one instrument of colossal power.
The total number of possible connections within this human brain are greater than the number of particles in the known universe.
Much of the awesome power of brain and mind has so far defied scientific explanation. In particular, how we are conscious beings, aware of ourselves, others, and the world around.
Science today is unable to explain how the human mind or consciousness comes to be.
And making consciousness even more intriguing, the capacity of the human mind to experience higher forms of consciousness that might be described as spiritual.
There are many people in the world who, for whatever reason, can't accept the doctrines of any particular faith, but who would describe themselves as spiritual.
For some, this higher consciousness includes a sense of a spiritual presence many call God.
Spirituality is a normal part of the human experience, and in our opinion, the reason for that is that there really is a God.
Religious and spiritual experiences, they are among the most complex and important experiences that people have.
God is a lie, and people should not waste their time and waste their lives on it.
The fact that people develop beliefs, we know from history, is not even the slightest evidence that those beliefs are true.
Man certainly has the brain circuitry to invent God.
We have accounts from some people who have been atheists all their lives and said there is nothing, and turned at the moment of death to say to their family, I was wrong.
In this program, we investigate if human consciousness of God offers convincing evidence of his existence or is more likely delusion and wishful thinking.
I hope all human beings are engaged in the search for truth, whether they're religious or not.
Any journey into the fascinating and mysterious world of human consciousness should start with what we already know about the power of the human brain.
The major component of it is the neuron, which is basically a device for sending information from one place to another. And it has 10 billion neurons in it. Each neuron is like a small computer.
The brain is a phenomenal organ. Even simple physical actions require complex brain power.
Just the process of walking requires a remarkable degree of control. When we run, it's even more complicated because we're quite literally flying between each foothold, and that requires even greater degree of control of the limbs and body posture by the brain. In terms of something still more complex, say proving a theorem, composing a symphony, we don't really know how to measure the complexity of a feat like that.
A university philosophy class in which students are wrestling with big questions.
Because of your own personal thing.
Yeah, okay, good. What I want to talk about is moral facts and how to account for them.
Right and wrong.
Every brain is multitasking. An astonishing amount of the work is being done at a subconscious level.
The back part of the brain is the input, so that deals with the sensory information. You've got vision, you've got hearing, you've got touch. The visual cortex will be analysing what they're actually seeing. The auditory cortex will be highly activated because they're listening, and the language parts of the brain will be working out what the words mean. All this is being put together to derive some sort of high-level meaning.
The meaning students gain from this experience takes place within the mind, which neuroscientists often distinguish from the brain.
The brain typically is regarded as the material part of ourselves, the part that's in our head that enables us to have our thoughts and our feelings and our beliefs. The mind tends to be regarded as the functions of that brain. It is those beliefs, the thoughts, the feelings, and so forth, the things that you can't really touch per se.
The mind doesn't sit in some subsection of the brain. The mind really is the entire pattern of activity distributed over the whole brain.
As the place where our awareness, our thoughts and beliefs reside, it's the mind that gives us consciousness.
Mind and consciousness are essentially the same thing.
How billions of neurons in the human brain produce our sense of being conscious is one of the great unknowns in science.
We all know we are conscious, but we actually don't know what consciousness is. And that's called the hard problem of consciousness.
We don't have the basic idea of what a thought is. I cannot tell you molecularly or chemically what a thought is. We do not know what a memory is. I know a little bit about the molecules that are involved. I know that neurons are involved and some chemicals are involved, but I cannot tell you physically what a memory is.
We understand fairly well how brain cells work and how they're linked together, and we know that they're linked through a bit of electricity and some chemical processes. Yet we don't know how, from the activity of these cells, we have this amazing phenomena of thought, awareness, feelings, emotions, everything that makes us unique as individuals. We're intimately involved with our thought processes every day, and what we do really comes about as a consequence of our thoughts.
Deepening the mystery. Human consciousness goes beyond our awareness of the physical world. There is evidence of higher levels of consciousness which seem, in some way, spiritual. Exploring and experiencing this higher state of mind is centrally important in Buddhism.
There certainly is a state of mind above ordinary consciousness. It's not very difficult to experience. All you need to do really is to learn to meditate. The Buddha said that if you were to sort of have a picture of the human mind, the bottom part of it has got lots of negatives in it, which is caught up with ordinary consciousness. The trouble is we tend to be addicted to that part of consciousness. And often many people don't even know that there's other kind of consciousness. A Buddhist model, even an Eastern model, it always assumes that there are greater and greater depths to the mind. And people often experience moments of that. So people can experience that listening to a concert of music. A friend of mine had a very deep experience listening to Bach. I've had deep experiences looking at paintings. Often it's an aesthetic experience that you start to, outside of meditation at least, touch these higher levels of consciousness.
John Rutter is a composer of largely religious music and believes that music can be an important bridge to higher levels of consciousness.
It seems to me that music has some mysterious core which is probably spiritual. There are things which we experience in our daily lives the whole time which just can't be articulated in words or explained or analysed. The thing about music is that it goes beyond the rational, and therefore there's a kind of metaphoric resonance between that and the things in life which are mysterious. I suppose Mendelssohn put it best when he said, music takes over where words leave off. So in a way, we're confronting as composers something very mysterious each and every day. Why does an idea suddenly come to you? Where does it come from? Now, someone like Johann Sebastian Bach or Joseph Haydn would have said it was sent from God. And the reality is hard work. But are we visited by some mysterious force that takes us over? I don't know.
The human mind is a powerful phenomenon that scientists are of course drawn to investigate and try to explain. Inevitably, they turn to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection for some answers. It describes how, from simple beginnings, complex life has developed step by step. Can this process explain the wonders of the human mind and brain?
There's an enormous amount of evidence that our minds as well as our bodies were shaped by natural selection. We certainly know that many of our mental functions are shared with other primates. Natural selection is a process that can generate complexity, local complexity, and there's no reason to think that it can't explain the complexity of the human brain.
The theory of natural selection relies on a random, mindless process to produce intelligent life, including human consciousness. Some scientists find this explanation unconvincing.
It tells me that the mind is the brain, and the brain is the product of an unguided, mindless process. Why should I believe anything that comes to me through that kind of a filter, through a machine that has been constructed by randomness and the laws of nature? It seems to me to make far more sense that the mind is the product of a rational creator.
Human consciousness is one of the highest levels of complexity that there is. So to reduce all that to saying, well, it's just neurons firing, is missing the big picture entirely, which unfortunately some of our atheist and agnostic scientists do often. So an Islamic perspective is this is all part of God's creation, because it is through our mind that we know God.
Random events can give the impression of design. I mean, the whole of evolution, if you like, culminating, we like to think, in us, is purely random. It's not guided in any sense. And that's quite extraordinary. We are very complex beings, and we have emerged without any divine guidance.
There's one very dogmatic form of neo-Darwinism, which says that actually we've got all the explanations we need, we can show that evolution occurred, we can show how it occurred, we've got it all taped. I'm afraid that's just arrogance, really, and almost certainly false.
Especially since Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, many have concluded that human beings are no more than the products of nature. This contrasts with a much older view that can be traced back to philosophers of ancient Greece, that human beings are not only physical, but spiritual beings. They have souls. Some modern attempts to explain consciousness seem to draw on this idea.
Some have suggested that consciousness is something that is beyond our physical bodies, and it is something that our brain is not so much generating, but conducting through.
Your mind is an immaterial reality. I believe that the mind inhabits the brain. That the best way to understand it is like your brain is a TV set and your mind is the signal.
Electromagnetic waves we know can interact with brain cells. And so it may be that the human mind is something similar. It interacts with the brain, and also brain cells can interact with the mind, but it isn't produced from the brain.
If there's an immaterial mind in each human being, there probably is an immaterial mind behind the universe. And it's perfectly reasonable scientifically to believe that, and I don't think that it's going to be disproven, because I think it's true.
Adding intrigue to the search for an explanation of consciousness is that across the world and in every culture, billions of people express consciousness of a higher power some call God. Towering over this small, self-effacing high street is Ely Cathedral. This grand building represents a line of Christian heritage at Ely stretching back to the 7th century. Ornate and vast, it was designed to make a statement about the power of God and to connect human consciousness to the spiritual world.
I think people are surprised by that experience when they come here. Most of them come as tourists to see the architecture, and yet, amazingly, they discover something profoundly spiritual here among us. Somehow there is a sense of God's grace and presence and a sense of being loved, which is a profound and meaningful experience.
If I'm just present in a lovely cathedral, I do feel touched by something other, and I can't put it into words, but I know that it must be something other because I keep going back and back. It's something that I just find compelling and inspiring at the same time. It does raise me and countless millions of other people in some way upwards, and that's the only direction I can point it in.
I think that often people are disillusioned with the church as an institution, but are interested in the reality, spiritual reality of God.
About 1/3 of the world's population claims to be Christian. Of those who attend church, many believe that here, somehow, they can actually experience God.
It's about a relationship with a God who loves us and who's revealed himself to us in Christ. It's a place where we put ourselves in God's presence and learn from him and are there expectant for him to meet with us.
The body of Christ. The body of Christ.
Around 1/4 of the world's population is Muslim, a religion in which adherents also express God consciousness with the belief that they can make a personal connection.
The term God consciousness is about knowing God and being mindful of God's presence at all times. The Muslim prayer is talking directly to God. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us that if you concentrate and focus in your prayer, then God focuses upon you. God consciousness is to tap into higher aspects of living, and that's really what faith and religion is supposed to elevate us to.
Belief in God has influenced individual lives and shaped societies for millennia. But in a world increasingly encouraged to think scientifically and rationally, religious faith is being judged by some as make-believe.
As a child, I went to Sunday school in a congregational church and learned quite a lot about the Bible stories. I was not particularly skeptical until I was a teenager. Then I became skeptical, and it just hit me that this was all a lot of nonsense.
I certainly used to go to Church of England services, perhaps because my parents wanted me out of the house on Sundays, but that became a rhythm of the week. But it's when I got to university, really, and started to think for myself that I lost all belief in a God.
I don't like magic, I don't like superstition. I think it's fine for children, I think it's fine for entertainment. But for adults, coming to grapple with our place in the universe, I think we have an imperative to understand it, to not settle for authority or dogma or superstition.
Among human beings, superstition is common. Even on some modern cruise ships, there is no apparently unlucky Deck 13.
Deck 14.
Crowds gather at the Trevi Fountain in Rome, many following the superstition that throwing a coin into the fountain ensures a return to the city. Perhaps religion falls into this category of mythical belief.
A great deal of religion is simply wishful thinking. The wishful thinking that there is something grander than what we can see.
People are disappointingly gullible in their belief systems. It's not a matter that anything goes, that we'll swallow anything that we're taught. But given the right circumstances, given the right authority figures, given a little bit of motivation to believe, we can swallow quite a bit.
Professor Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist, has closely investigated why we believe what we believe.
I think that the brain is really a belief machine. It has no choice but to construct beliefs about everything. Religion, spirituality, science, politics, God, all of us develop ideas that work for us. Things that make sense to us could be very different than what makes sense to somebody else. To a large degree, a lot of our beliefs are given to us. We like to think that we believe things because we came to it. But the evidence really points to the opposite. Our brain is trying to help us establish at least something that works for us, and then we ultimately call that truth.
We exist to show the reality of God to a skeptical world.
What I do believe is that man certainly has the capability to invent God. We certainly have the brain circuitry to do that, and we have the capacity.
Across the world, there are many different faiths which inspire people and comfort them in the belief that there is something beyond themselves. But the profound differences in belief and practice between those religions could mean that they're based on nothing more than culture and tradition.
To some extent, our evidence for believing in things is that other people believe in them. That's why countries tend to have one particular belief system.
Even though I'm a religious believer, it seems to me religious beliefs, maybe in particular, need that extra scrutiny. We need to think carefully about our beliefs.
One of the roots of belief is cultural conditioning, that God is present in the cradle, effectively, and so a child is surrounded by God thoughts. And the culture of a particular country impresses the belief in God and religious attitudes in general on a young brain. And I think it sticks with people through their life. They can't divest it.
With all their differences, religions do seem to be contradictory. But what religions have in common is perhaps more significant than what divides them.
It's surely the case that particular religious beliefs vary, sometimes dramatically, across cultural groups. It doesn't follow from that there isn't some kind of natural anchor that sort of tethers all of these different beliefs.
Their primary concern as religions is to help people to have a sense of union with God, a supreme reality of wisdom, compassion, and bliss. That is common to all major world traditions.
What culture seems to provide is the particulars, but the idea that there's a God of some sort seems to be pretty natural.
The former Soviet Union. Perhaps no culture has more aggressively tested the strength and tenacity of belief in God. The communist leadership demanded allegiance only to the state. Despite more than 70 years trying to kill God off and eliminate religion from society, God remains. The Soviet Union does not.
In looking at the Soviet Union, what I was interested in is how can you make religion go away? Couldn't you make everyone become an atheist? The Soviet experiment kind of tested that hypothesis and showed that it's not really that correct. Because in the Soviet Union, you had a destruction of religious institutions, but you still had the persistence of religious belief. But what I found fascinating is that they couldn't fully erase kind of the idea or belief in larger supernatural concepts, mainly belief in God. There is an attractiveness to this larger idea of God that I think the Soviets never really fully understood.
I think that human beings do have a genetic propensity for spirituality. And I think that's why spirituality is such a powerful force, why it has survived over all this long period of history, while it's found in every single culture around the globe. I think that humans are hardwired to be able to get outside of themselves and to be self-transcendent.
are we naturally calibrated to have religious and spiritual experiences? And I think that the evidence suggests that we are.
What I think lots of different religious traditions are pointing at is just this kind of idea that if we're created by some kind of God who wants to have some kind of positive engagement with us, a relationship, then of course our very nature is going to be receptive to that engagement.
But perhaps there's a reason for belief that doesn't depend on God at all. Just as scientists turn to evolution to explain the natural world, so it's being used to explain the development of religion. Perhaps belief in God survives because it offers believers an advantage, hope in difficult circumstances. Professor David Sloan Wilson has studied extensively how the principles of evolution can be seen at work in society.
This is an evolutionary account of religion, adapting people to their local environments that holds communities together and provides a sense of meaning, a powerful sense of meaning, really gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you to do good things, not bad things. Our beliefs, personal and collective, are about survival value. It does not reflect an actual relationship with God. Nothing about humanity makes sense except in the light of evolution.
Evolution teaches that we are selfish creatures focused on our own survival, if necessary at the expense of others. But intriguingly, human beings show they can behave morally, whether they are religious or not.
Why we have a sense of morality? Why can we overcome our instincts? Why do we have things such as altruism, for example?
I mean, I think it is a real philosophical wrong to steal things from other people. I think it's a violation. But the way that we arrived at that feeling or that thought in our brains is, of course, by evolution, as is the case for everything that we do.
A truly Darwinian world would be a world in which there was the survival of the fittest, that is, the most aggressive and the most ruthless. It would be a world in which no one strove for justice because nobody believed in it. And it would be a world in which might rather than right ruled.
Human beings have an inherent sense of right and wrong. The question is, what motivates it? Rejecting the view that answers are found in evolution alone, Professor John Lennox argues that morality is part of the human consciousness of God.
What I'm not saying is that atheists can't behave morally. Of course they can, sometimes put Christians to shame. Everybody can behave morally from where I sit, because everybody is made in the image of God as a moral being.
Fears have been expressed that where a society abandons God, it might go on to redefine what is morally acceptable and act in its own selfish interest, with potentially tragic consequences.
Nazi Germany sought to get rid of one particular religion called Judaism by destroying Jews. Stalinist Russia sought to get rid of all religions by pursuing dialectical materialism. Both were as tyrannical and profoundly inhumane as it is possible for a society to be. And frankly, a world without God, a world in which human beings act without any sense of cosmic justice, is a world that terrifies me. And that is my crisis of faith.
Belief in God might influence societies to behave more morally. But the crux of the matter is not whether belief in God's existence has benefits, but rather whether it's true. For most, personal experience is the key factor in deciding what's true and what's real, leading some to argue that a person's experience is an important way of investigating whether or not God is real.
In the end, I think personal experience is a decisive factor in believing in God. That personal experience is the most important thing there is. So I would take it very seriously.
Valhalla, New York State, a centre of the Catholic order Legionaries of Christ. Having rejected more lucrative careers and sacrificing the kind of relationships normally taken for granted, why are these young men dedicating 13 years of their lives to train for the priesthood?
The reason that they are here is because they have had in some way an encounter with Christ in their own lives. At some point they felt that call of God to give their lives to the service of others.
They claim to have had an encounter with God, but what does that really mean? What form does this encounter take?
You are aware somehow of the presence of someone in your soul and not something that's just from personal desire. Sometimes you're in a situation where you don't see what you should be doing, and you go to prayer and say, Lord, help me with this situation. And often in that context of spiritual openness, you will receive this sense of certainty about something, and about God's presence and about what God's will is for you, and a sense, again, of peace also with perhaps with the decision that you're trying to make. We have an experience of something beyond ourselves. Very often that kind of experience of the presence of God happens in the context of meditative prayer. If you're always listening to your iPod, if you're always on the phone, if you're always watching television, listening to the radio, you're so filled with noise that even if God is trying to talk to you, you can't hear him. But that atmosphere of silence and of prayer, others perhaps praying around you, is very conducive to being receptive to hearing the voice of God in your interior.
God is a lie, and people should not waste their time and waste their lives on it.
But religion doesn't just disable you, it honors the disability. It treats irrationality as a wonderful thing. It doesn't just excuse irrationality, it celebrates it.
When you hear some of these arguments of atheists, sometimes the thought, at least critics say, well, gee, maybe they're right, you know? But I always go back there to my experience of God in my own life. I have had many times experiences that seem humanly impossible to explain if God isn't real. And so I think I also have rational reasons to at least say that my faith is not irrational.
God can't be seen. And therefore, God becomes very distant, but stays close to human beings through words, through language. God hears, and God speaks to us within the silence of the soul.
Even though the priests have few doubts about the reality of their spiritual experience, a question that remains is whether their certainty might have a more earthly explanation.
It might be possible to press a button in the brain or set off a few chemicals or set off a few genes that makes you feel like God is present. That doesn't tell you whether or not there really is a God. It just tells you that you experience God through chemical reactions in your brain.
A recent scientific study has suggested that a sense of God could be linked to a specific part of the brain which, when activated, produces the sense of having spiritual experience.
We somewhat playfully titled that the God gene. We went out and asked thousands of people questions about their feelings of spirituality. We took little samples of their DNA, looked at a lot of different genes, and we found one particular gene that was correlated with people's sense of spirituality. But it tends to tip the balance between people who are very spiritual and those who are less spiritual.
But there's considerable opposition to the view that spiritual consciousness can be explained simply in terms of genes.
When people are engaged in religious thought and religious practice and religious activity, it's not a particular part of the brain that's active. Recent studies show, look, it's the whole brain, lots of different parts of the brain, and it's not isolated to one little area or region, not one God spot.
There is no simple switch explanation for why some people believe in God and some don't. It would be wiser to look at their personal experiences than to be rummaging around in their brain.
I think that either God invented man or man invented God. One of those two is probably correct. I think it's important as scientists that we don't pretend that somehow we have a secret microscope or a secret measuring device that allows us to make that critical philosophical distinction.
The attempt to find a God gene is motivated by the expectation that science can explain spiritual consciousness. But this is an area where we must recognize the limitations of science. For many believers, belief in God has had the effect of transforming their lives, and for them at least, that points to the real existence of God.
Well, it started out as a little girl being rejected by my father, and because of that, I really searched for love all my life. I started drinking at a really young age. I started doing drugs, hanging out in nightclubs and places that a little girl really shouldn't be. Most of my friends at that time were drug dealers, and I never really had to pay for drugs. You know, drugs were always easily available to me. As I grew up, as I got older, I was working at a brokerage firm, and it was there that I had a manager who was a Christian.
One more time, can we put our hands together and just bless our God? You're awesome.
She had a joy and a peace that I had never experienced before. And over the course of years, she would invite me to church, and I kept refusing to go. She never gave up. She continued to invite me to church, and finally I accepted. So I showed up at the Brooklyn Tabernacle one Sunday, and the moment that I walked into that place, I knew that there was something different. I could sense the love of God, and I felt like my search had ended, that this was the thing that I needed. The choir sung, Pastor Simba spoke, and it was like he was speaking to me. I felt like there was no one else in the whole sanctuary but me. And he talked about the love of God, the very thing that I needed to hear. At the end of the message, he asked, is there anyone in the building who wants to give their heart to the Lord and experience this love? So I responded to the altar call, and right there at that altar, I knew that my life had been changed. When I went to work the next day, they knew that something happened to me because there was a change in my countenance. There was a joy and a peace that I never had before and I had now had experienced. The only way to really describe it is just an inner knowing, an inner ability to recognize, that it was God.
Sylvia's experience is far from being an isolated one. Darrington Prison in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Locked up inside are some of America's most dangerous prisoners. But the gates have been opened to Prison Fellowship, an organization aiming to connect prisoners with Christian faith in the hope of bringing real change to their lives.
These are some of the worst offenders in the system. Guys here have life sentences. Guys here have spent, a lot of them, 20, 25, maybe even 30 years incarcerated.
Doing things that if I'd have been in my right mind, I probably never would have even dreamed of doing.
I jumped in the river with handcuffs on. I tried to make the police kill me.
I had no reason to live.
Despite the serious and often violent levels of crime involved, more than 60 prisoners in Darrington Jail claim their lives have been transformed through a prison fellowship program that encouraged them to open their minds to God.
I sincerely prayed, God, help me, clean me up. Man, I'm no good.
I'm no longer rebellious against the things that are morally just and right.
And I asked God to give me the strength. Give me the strength to change my life because I really want to change my life.
I've seen ex-gang members, ex-gang leaders, guys who were not only experiencing hits on their lives, but placing hits on other people's lives. I've seen them lay all of that down.
Once a senior member of the Nixon government in Washington, Chuck Colson was found guilty of involvement in the Watergate scandal and sent to prison.
I was a tough politician, a political leader, known as the White House hatchet man, which meant I was the tough guy in the Nixon White House.
While in prison, Chuck Colson became convinced that belief in God had the power to transform character. On his release, he founded Prison Fellowship to share that belief with prisoners worldwide.
If after you've had this kind of an encounter where you really have sincerely prayed to ask God into your life, you're going to be noticing some changes. So yes, it has to be personally transformative.
People know I'm different. I got a direction to go, and I love it. I wouldn't change it for anything in the world.
And I've seen this now. I've been in 600, 700 prisons, 40 countries around the world. So when you ask, is Christianity true? Yeah, it produces the results it promises to produce. That's a test of truth.
Naturally, atheists challenge the view that transformed lives provide credible evidence of God being real.
I think there's a category in between self-delusion and lie. It straddles them. Religion becomes a confuser. It gives people the illusion that there are simple answers to very complicated questions when there aren't.
Islam attracts a very large number of converts in the Western world especially, and many of them would agree that Islam has helped to turn their lives around. So certainly a good religion can transform people's lives, turn them around. Religion can of course be used in negative ways also, and that's something we have to be very careful about and guard against.
Now, I'm not stupid. I know there's frauds, as there are in every life. But I would like to challenge the atheists to produce 62 people who've been utterly transformed by their atheist beliefs.
If all of the usual recipes for success have failed, you start to range farther and farther afield. You have a fatal illness and medicine doesn't work, religion is going to start to sound pretty attractive.
And there's nothing that can ever convince me that this is not God changing a life, because the change didn't take place from the outside. It took place on the inside.
Christianity is centrally claiming that God wants to empower us to live the kind of life that is upright, that is satisfying, that is fulfilled. Now, when that happens, I have no hesitation in saying that for me is the final bit of evidence.
So what can you do? You just say, well, either this lot are deluded or that lot is missing something. And I think the easiest explanation is they're just religion deaf. It's like being tone deaf. There's beautiful music going on, but they just can't hear it.
Atheists frequently don't realize the incredible diversity and richness that these experiences and these beliefs actually are for people. And therefore, I think that they really miss the broader implications of what religion and spirituality is all about for people, and why it is so important for many, many people, and why it's been so important throughout the centuries and the millennia and throughout every tradition and culture.
Our consciousness has evolved as a mechanism of survival. And it's not surprising that sometimes those brains go awry and start having hallucinations. And I'm afraid people who assert that consciousness is a keyhole through which they can glimpse God are just imposing their own wishes onto it.
Consciousness remains a mystery which scientists continue to probe. The enigma is not just where it comes from, but does it continue after we die? Not surprisingly, some studies are focusing on the experience of people who have reached the point of death, and whose experience might therefore provide crucial pointers towards whether it really is the end of all consciousness. Neuropsychiatrist Peter Fenwick is a leading authority on the mental states of the dying. He investigates patients' reports of their experiences as life is ending.
We know about death because we've studied it. First of all, we've collected stories. We've got about 2,000 accounts from relatives of the dying about what happens when people die. What we have found is that the dying process is not as we think. It's not just a switching off. There's some very interesting phenomena which occur.
People in about 24 hours or so prior to death sometimes seem to have an experience of seeing their deceased relatives. And this has been described often by hospice workers or nurses who take care of patients, or even families.
But investigation into the experience of dying can go one step further. It focuses on patients who have been clinically dead and then successfully resuscitated.
Signs of breathing? Yes. He is, right. Marvellous.
Their reports of experiences during the time of clinical death is crucially important in shedding light in an area of deep mystery.
Death is defined when the heart stops beating, and as a consequence a person stops breathing immediately and the brain also shuts down. There is no electrical activity, you get a flatline electrical silence state. And so at that time we would expect there to be no activity of the mind or consciousness. However, what we have observed is that a proportion of people do indeed have this ability to have thought processes, memories, reasoning, and very detailed recall of what had objectively happened when they had reached the point of death.
Ken Spearpoint and Gilly Traynor are members of the resuscitation team at Hammersmith Hospital, London. When they're called in, the situation is literally a matter of life or death.
They're all technically dead at the point at which we start compressing their chest. At 1 in 10 of them report anecdotally they feel as though they've taken a journey through a tunnel. They describe this sense of well-being, of unbelievable well-being, and ultimately they end up in a wonderful place. And this phenomena appears to cross the whole range of cultural beliefs.
A small number of patients assessed as clinically dead also report being detached from their bodies and able to see the resuscitation itself.
Now this is extraordinarily interesting, because if the brain isn't working, but yet people can gather information, then it's absolutely fundamental.
This underlying question is of great importance to science and to the God question.
If you switch the brain off and you can demonstrate scientifically the mind also switches off, then you've proven that the mind is produced from the brain. If on the other hand you switch the brain off and the mind and consciousness is still continuing, then you've demonstrated that it must be a separate, undiscovered scientific entity, and that's what we're trying to do.
Back in Hammersmith Hospital, the questions continue to be asked, focusing on out-of-body experience. A test has been set up here and in hospitals across the world. Typically, in resuscitation rooms, an eye-catching headline is positioned where a patient, separated from their body, might read it.
And so the fascinating question is, are these experiences real or not? And this is the first large-scale study that will be able to demonstrate whether those experiences really occurred when the person had died and had no activity of the brain, or whether, although seeming real to the individual, they were simply illusions and not real. So we're now at the point of trying to determine which of those explanations is correct.
I don't think the bar, as far as near-death experiences and reading the Daily Mail from the ceiling, is too high in any sense. I think that's where we are. And I think that's the bar that now has to be cleared.
Naturally, the reliability of reports about near-death experience are challenged by some scientists.
My understanding is that near-death experiences, which are also sometimes adduced to as a kind of support for the existence of a soul that can survive separately from the body, can all be explained as cases of what happens when the brain is deprived of oxygen as its physiology starts to wind down.
I can certainly imagine that when dying, all these things could start collapsing, so you would have extremely weird experiences of where you were and what was happening, and you might well float up in this way.
The experiment continues in medical centres across Europe and North America. Meanwhile, Dr. Sam Parnia feels tentative conclusions can be drawn.
The preliminary findings suggest that the people who believe that there's nothing instantly as soon as you die are probably not correct, because the evidence suggests that at least for the early period of death, mind and consciousness is continuing.
Human consciousness is both complex and powerful. It ranges from a sense of self and the world around to a sense of God. The key question is whether consciousness is evidence of the mind of a Father God or the chemistry of Mother Nature alone.
Are we just a bunch of chemicals running around in a bag? I think of life a little bit more poetically than that. What I do think is that every thought that we have, every memory that we possess, every feeling that we express, every emotion that we experience are nothing but chemical signals in the brain.
If we have consciousness, and it is a reality, and it's essentially an immaterial reality, then there probably is a mind behind the universe.
I think we have to look at all the perspectives that exist that may help us along the way, and that does include psychological, consciousness, spiritual, and other types of perspectives that may ultimately be as valuable, if not more valuable, than what science may be able to offer.
I don't think I would want there to be a God. I find the prospect of learning, going to heaven and finding that there was a God sort of disagreeable, actually.
God, being ultimate reality, who created us, to miss that is to miss the ultimate purpose for life itself.
Is there life after death? It's a really interesting question, and one I'd love to know the answer to. But the people to find out from is to ask the dying. They know. They'll tell you.